Revolution and Counter-Revolution, or Germany in 1848, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Chapter 15, The Triumph of Prussia, July 27th, 1852. We now come to the last chapter in the history of the German Revolution, the conflict of the National Assembly with the governments of the different states, especially in Prussia, the insurrection of southern and western Germany, and its final overthrow by Prussia. We have already seen the Frankfurt National Assembly at work. We have seen it kicked by Austria, insulted by Prussia, disobeyed by the lesser states, duped by its own impotent central government, which again was the dupe of all and every prince in the country. But at last things began to look threatening for this weak, vacillating, insipid legislative body. It was forced to come to the conclusion that the sublime idea of German unity was threatened in its realization, which meant neither more nor less than that of the Frankfurt Assembly, and all it had done, and was about to do, were very likely to end in smoke. Thus it set to work in good earnest in order to bring forth, as soon as possible, its grand production, the Imperial Constitution. There was, however, one difficulty. What executive government was there to be? An executive council? No, that would have been, they thought in their wisdom, making Germany a republic. A president? That would come to the same. Thus they must revive the old imperial dignity. But, as of course a prince was to be emperor, who should it be? Certainly none of the Die Minorum Gentium, from Reus, Schleiz, Greiz, Lobenstein, Eversdorf up to Bavaria. Neither Austria nor Prussia would have borne that. It could only be Austria or Prussia. But which of the two? There is no doubt that under otherwise favorable circumstances, this august assembly would be sitting up to the present day, discussing this important dilemma without being able to come to a conclusion if the Austrian government had not cut the Gordian knot and saved them the trouble. Austria knew very well that from the moment in which she could again appear before Europe with all her provinces subdued, as a strong and great European power, the very law of political gravitation would draw the remainder of Germany into her orbit, without the help of any authority which an imperial crown, conferred by the Frankfurt Assembly, could give her. Austria had been far stronger, far freer in her movements, since she took off the powerless crown of the German Empire, a crown which clogged her own independent policy, while it added not one iota to her strength, either within or without Germany. And supposing the case that Austria could not maintain her footing in Italy and Hungary, why, then she was dissolved, annihilated in Germany too, and could never pretend to reseize a crown which had slipped from her hands while she was in full possession of her strength. Thus Austria at once declared against all imperialist resurrections, and plainly demanded the restoration of the German Diet, the only central government of Germany known and recognized by the treaties of 1815, and on the 4th of March, 1849, issued that constitution which had no other meaning than to declare Austria an indivisible, centralized, and independent monarchy, distinct even from that Germany which the Frankfurt Assembly was to reorganize. This open declaration of war left, indeed, the Frankfurt wiseacres no other choice but to exclude Austria from Germany, and to create out of the remainder of that country a sort of lower empire, a little Germany, the rather shabby imperial mantle of which was to fall on the shoulders of His Majesty of Prussia. This, it will be recollected, was the renewal of an old project fostered already some 6 or 8 years ago by a party of South and Middle German liberal doctrinaires, who considered as a godsend the degrading circumstances by which their old crochet was now again brought forward as the latest new move for the salvation of the country. They accordingly finished in February and March 1849 the debate on the Imperial Constitution, together with the Declaration of Rights and the Imperial Electoral Law. Not, however, without being obliged to make, in a great many points, the most contradictory concessions, now to the conservative or rather reactionary party, now to the more advanced factions of the Assembly. In fact, it was evident that the leadership of the Assembly, which had formerly belonged to the right and right-center, the conservatives and reactionists, was gradually, although slowly, passing towards the left or democratic side of that body. The rather dubious position of the Austrian deputies in an assembly which had excluded their country from Germany, and in which they were yet called upon to sit and vote, favored the derangement of its equipoise, and thus, as early as the end of February, the left, center, and left found themselves, by the help of the Austrian votes, very generally in a majority, while in other days the conservative faction of the Austrians, all of a sudden, and for the fun of the thing, voting with the right, threw the balance again on the other side. They intended, by these sudden soubresauts, to bring the assembly into contempt, which, however, was quite unnecessary, the mass of the people being long since convinced of the utter hollowness and futility of anything coming from Frankfurt. What a specimen of a constitution, in the meantime, was framed under such jumping and counter-jumping may easily be imagined. The left of the assembly, this elite and pride of revolutionary Germany, as it believed itself to be, was entirely intoxicated with the few paltry successes it obtained by the goodwill, or rather the ill will, of a set of Austrian politicians acting under the instigation and for the interest of Austrian despotism. Whenever the slightest approximations to their own not very well-defined principles had, in a homeopathically diluted shape, obtained a sort of sanction by the Frankfurt Assembly, these Democrats proclaimed that they had saved the country and the people. These poor weak-minded men, during the course of their generally very obscure lives, had been so little accustomed to anything like success that they actually believed their paltry amendments, passed with 2 or 3 votes majority, would change the face of Europe. They had, from the beginning of their legislative career, been more imbued than any other faction of the Assembly with that incurable malady, parliamentary cretinism, a disorder which penetrates its unfortunate victims with a solemn conviction that the whole world, its history and future, are governed and determined by a majority of votes in that particular representative body which has the honor to count them among its members, and that all and everything going on outside the walls of their house, wars, revolutions, railway constructing, colonizing of whole new continents, California gold discoveries, Central American canals, Russian armies, and whatever else might have some little claim to influence upon the destinies of mankind, is nothing compared with the incommensurable events hinging upon the important question, whatever it may be, just at that moment occupying the attention of their honorable House. Thus it was the Democratic party of the Assembly, by effectually smuggling a few of their nostrums into the Imperial Constitution, first became bound to support it, although in every essential point it flatly contradicted their own oft-proclaimed principles, and at last, when this mongrel work was abandoned, and bequeathed to them by its main authors, accepted the inheritance, and held out for this monarchical constitution, even in opposition to everybody who then proclaimed their own republican principles. But it must be confessed that in this the contradiction was merely apparent. The indeterminate, self-contradictory, immature character of the Imperial Constitution was the very image of the immature, confused, conflicting political ideas of these democratic gentlemen. And if their own sayings and writings, so far as they could write, were not sufficient proof of this, their actions would furnish such proof. For among sensible people it is a matter of course to judge a man, not by his professions, but by his actions, not by what he pretends to be, but by what he does, and what he really is, and the deeds of these heroes of German democracy speak loud enough for themselves, as we shall learn by and by. However, the Imperial Constitution, with all its appendages and paraphernalia, was definitely passed, and on the 28th of March, the King of Prussia was, by 290 votes against 248 who abstained, and 200 who were absent, elected Emperor of Germany minus Austria. The historical irony was complete. the imperial farce executed in the streets of astonished Berlin 3 days after the Revolution of March 18th, 1848, by Friedrich William IV, while in a state which elsewhere would come under the Maine liquor law, this disgusting farce, just 1 year afterwards, had been sanctioned by the pretended representative assembly of all Germany. That, then, was the result of the German Revolution. London, July 1852.